Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or anybody you know would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossadon.org. I'm looking forward to this conversation. We're having some great stuff. We're talking about cars, we're talking about tech, we're talking about all sorts of stuff, and we had to stop because it was time. And I got my coffee ready, and I'm excited to introduce my guest, Brian Ketelson. Brian, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Brian Ketelson. I drank all my coffee already this morning. If I have too much more today, things aren't going to go well for anybody around me. So it's probably better if I don't have coffee with this chat.
Sure. To be fair, though, like, as my child says, you're in the future. So, like, I mean, we're getting to the point where it's too late in the day on your side of the world to drink coffee. Because yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. Like, if I have a coffee like afternoon, like I'm a yeah.
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 And I've noticed the older I get, the more that dial moves backwards, So now it's like any caffeine after say 2 p.m. is danger. Very
I
much danger.
I read an article the other day, and this has nothing to do with tech and open source, so I apologize to everybody listening, expecting that. But like, I was reading an article about circadian rhythms and like sleeping and how things like caffeine or whatever affects your sleep cycle, and this in the I can't remember the exact percentage, but I'm just gonna give an anecdotal number. So basically, if you sleep or if you're awake 2 hours between the time of 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. for 5 days a week, it throws off your circadian rhythm enough that over time you have an X% increase in getting things like cancer or heart disease
Hmm.
or some of these things. And I was thinking, I'm like, I mean, I go to bed at like 10:30, so like I mean I'm fine. But like I know so many people that go to bed at midnight, they stay up until 1 or 2 a.m. I mean, I yeah, I it's that's a fascinating thing. I wonder like, how long that has to go on for before you actually start to see like noticeable increases in your chance of getting those things. And obviously, even if your chances are high, it's still not 100%, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for real. I've noticed in my personal experience that blood pressure, my blood pressure is really well tied to my sleep over time.
Hmm.
A couple weeks with poor sleep and my blood pressure goes up, which is crazy.
Yeah, we're getting to an age now where we have to worry about our health. I remember like in college, like going and playing basketball for 2 hours and then like stopping at Wendy's and eating like four cheeseburgers and like doing it every day. I mean, the
I don't know
one
about
thing.
you. I'm getting to an age where I'm starting to get AARP notices in the mail.
So I don't even want like this is a whole rant. Like, so I think my wife, as a joke, like signed me up for AARP because I get stuff constantly in the mail too. And I'm
Oh no.
37. I'm 37, so I'm not that old. And my wife, who's a bit of a budget conscious person, like she likes to coupon and that stuff. And she's like, "You get great deals on AARP." And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't care. Like, I'd rather spend an extra 200% than show up with an AARP card to like, I don't know, a hotel and be like, "Hey, can you give me the old person discount?" Like I'm not ready for that. Like my ego is
It's
fragile as
not
it is.
time. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not time.
So let's start the conversation. I'd like to, one of the things I'd love to hear from you, Brian, is I love hearing about tech origin stories, like how people got started. Do you recall when technology first introduced itself to you and like what that feeling was? Maybe give us some, information about the context and all of that. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so started pretty young. Uh, I can't even think of what the year might be, 1980 something. Lived in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and in Jackson Hole there are two kinds of people. There's the really, really rich people, the
Yeah,
Harrison Fords who live there, and then there's the other people that work for them. And we were definitely in the other people
sure.
category, just scraping by hand to mouth. And my mom got a second job at a grocery store just so she could charge her groceries against her paycheck so we could get
Mm,
groceries a couple weeks earlier than normal. We were really scraping. And somehow she ended up getting enough hours that she bought me at 10 or so, 11 years old, a TI 99 4A. And I'm not sure what encouraged her to do that or what inspired her to do that, but that was the end of my interest in much else
Sure.
at that time. I didn't have any way to save programs, so I would type them in. I'd go down to the library on my bicycle, type in
Yep.
code from Byte magazine or whatever it was at the time, and leave the computer on because couldn't turn it off. Otherwise, I'd have to type it
Sure.
back in. It took me 2 years with a paper route to save up enough money to get TI Extended Basic and a cassette player so I could save and reload my apps. But that was it. That was the beginning of a love affair with all things tech. But I never considered it as a career at all. When I joined the Army, I knew I was joining the Army just so I could get college money. But I fully intended to be a doctor when I went to college. I started pre-med. I did a year and a half of pre-med. And it wasn't until my grandma had a heart attack. We're in the hospital visiting her, and they're taking blood from her arm. And a drop of blood hits the ground. I just got all queasy and,
Oh yeah.
faint feeling. And I was like, maybe I shouldn't do this doctor thing. Maybe I'm too squeamish for it. And I changed my major to computer science because they had a decent computer science program at the school I was at. And that was the end of my medical career, which interestingly, anecdotally, the doctors I've talked to over the years say, family blood doesn't count. Somebody else is some
Yeah.
stranger that you're
Yeah.
treating, that's not a big deal. But when you see your family, you tend to get more upset or squeamish about it. So, I probably could have been a doctor. In an alternate universe, I'd be telling you about your cholesterol right now instead of talking about technology. But
That's
I like
fascinating.
this one.
Yeah, as somebody who is quite squeamish as well, like I don't do well with needles, I don't do well with blood. So, uh like I remember trying to donate blood when I was like a senior in high school, and the person that was like administering it was like, "I'm not doing this." I said, "Why?" She's like, "You'll pass out. Like if I put this needle in your arm, you're going to pass out." So like that's my level of weirdness. And it's are you still kind of in that boat? Like is it, or is it
Zero
just,
percent.
yeah.
I've got 5 kids. I've
Yeah,
seen
sure.
childbirth. I've treated traumatic injuries, gunshot wounds. I mean, you name it. I've seen it all.
Yeah,
And at some point, your need to take action takes over, and the squeamishness just kind of goes away.
sure,
You,
sure.
you see somebody hurting or bleeding or whatever, you just got to go take care of it rather than thinking about how scary that blood is or whatever. So
So,
yeah, I actually don't have a problem at all. One of the kids comes with gaping holes in their bodies.
sure,
We
sure.
fix it up. We go to the emergency room. Did that just a couple weeks ago.
Oh wow.
Just the
So
way it is.
I mean, being a parent is sometimes you get to deal with all sorts of like fascinating things. But when I guess when we were kids, like, I remember all the time, like I remember I sat on a couch and like a spring from the couch spoke through and like jabbed into my calf, and I had to like, I
Oh
remember like pulling the spring out, right? And like and my parents like just dealt with it. Like,
yeah,
I mean, I think you
rub
don't
some
have
dirt
any.
on it.
Yeah, I don't think you have any choices as a parent. Like, you just can't like tell your kid to like, I don't know, rub some dirt in it. Is like, sure, yeah, but like I guess like you have to do something because it is your kid and you love them. You want to make sure they're safe.
Yeah.
The so talking about tech a little bit, and like when you first got your first computing device, right? Like what sort of some of the things that you were interested in building? Was it as simple as like, I mean, I don't know the technology. Was it assembler? Was it was
So
it basic at that point?
yeah, it was basic on the
Yeah.
TI, and I built uh, interactive things. Prompt you for questions
Yeah.
and assemble the data and do responses. My dad was doing some. He was trying to get healthy at the
Mm.
time, and I built my first program was called Megaton, and he would enter the number of repetitions at each weight that he did
Oh,
for weightlifting,
that's
and it would
cool.
keep a running tally of how many pounds he had moved over his workout, with the ultimate goal of getting to like 1,000 pounds over some period of time. And so that was the first app I wrote, and it was text-based, and those screens, I think they had 24 lines on
Yeah.
the window. So, really big fat text on your TV because we didn't have monitors. We had TVs with RF adapters, and it was old school stuff.
So did it get to the 1,000 pounds?
Oh yeah, but many times over.
Yeah. Yeah. That you always see people in the gym. This I go to the gym a fair amount. Like you see people that you can tell they're like trying to lift as much weight as humanly possible. And it's very fascinating, like those sort of folks, because I feel like there's a level where when you're exercising, like, there's a point where I think where your body's just like, I'm just gonna lift as much as I can. I don't care about overall health or these sort of things. I just want to lift as much as possible. Was your dad somebody that like took pride, do you think, in the amount of like, or was there something just solely for like
Not at all.
a
No,
health
he,
thing?
he
Yeah,
started he started getting old, and he started feeling his body kind of fall apart, and he
sure.
realized he needed to do something. So, we bought a $25 Kmart weight set and
Oh
a little
yeah,
bench, and that was it.
yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it seems like you found kind of like a useful application of using technology. Have you kind of always kind of fallen into that category of technologist where like always are looking for problems to solve with technology, or do you bet more appreciate like the amount of effort that technology takes to help solve problems?
So I'm definitely a in the problem-solving pragmatist kind of camp.
Yeah,
I don't like computing for the sake of computing.
sure.
I need to be solving a problem of some sort. And there are computer scientists and there are programmers, and I'm definitely a programmer, not a theory person. I don't actually write particularly great code.
Sure.
Um, it's just the way it is, but my code always solves problems, and I love to combine things together in ways that haven't yet been done, and that's where I get my spark of excitement out of the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to agree. I've mentioned this a thousand times on the podcast. So, but basically, like, I not very good at math. So, like, the second that like computer science turned into like a math exercise, I started to lose a lot of interest. So I switched over to like a more information systems type of degree because, like you can use technology to solve business problems. That was far more interesting to me. Than trying to like figure out like, okay, like what's the big O notation for this? How do I, make things more performant? Like that wasn't something that was very interesting to me. So when you were going through and learning about computer science, were you interested in those sort of things, like the high level like academic side of computer science, or did you kind of stick straight to like the I like solving problems, like give me an idea to build an app for?
Yeah, I'm definitely in the problem solving side. I don't care about big O notation other than if I need to solve a performance issue. But
Sure.
I'm firmly in the camp that performance isn't a problem until it's a problem. And premature optimization is a big waste of time. So write your code, get the problem solved, and optimize it later if needed. You're never going to be Facebook. If you're
Yeah.
lucky, you'll be at a millionth of the scale, and you'll have those problems to solve, and you can hire a computer scientist to solve them because you'll have some money.
Yeah, I've always talked to people that are getting started in tech about, because people want to focus on maybe like, oh, I need to learn this technology, or I need to learn how to write in this particular type of programming language. And I just tell people, I remind them like 99% of the tech jobs out there is like, I have a data source, I need to have a UI for it.
Mhm.
Like that's like most of the job. It's not all of the job usually, but most people that are building apps are building like line of business apps, like apps that aren't even exposed to the internet to facilitate like some business function. Like, oh, I have an Excel spreadsheet. Like, Excel is not the best place to be doing everything, so maybe we should have a more sophisticated system to do it. When you were going through like, taking courses in school, and maybe even when you got started, like what were some of the technologies at the time that really resonated with you?
So I was in college when the internet was
Yeah.
becoming available to the world. It definitely existed before I was in college, but we're talking about, 1992 or so. Most internet accounts that you would get, ISPs that you would have, they would provide you a shell account on a
Hmm.
Unix server somewhere. And so the communication part fascinated me. I started learning as much as I could about networking and TCP/IP, and it wasn't much at the time. I mean, granted, it, at that time I thought I knew a lot, but
Yeah.
it wasn't much at all. But it was fascinating, and I loved making things communicate. I had an Amiga 500 at the time and an IBM PC clone of some sort. And I remember around 1993 taking a null modem cable and a serial cable and plugging the Amiga into the PC with Linux and getting the Amiga on the internet because there wasn't a way to put the
Sure.
Amiga on the internet before that. So, I created a serial connection from the PC to the Amiga and used the PC as a router. And I just thought I was the man. That was it. This is so
Sure.
cool. I built my own internet basically, and that was fun. Those kinds of experimentations are what drive me a lot.
So was it the, you mentioned a couple of things there that are interesting, right? Like, for instance, like the ability to like tinker with things to get to a point. And I think when we talk about open source, it's a lot of figuring out like, okay, how can I use technology to solve some problem, but like it's not doesn't fit into like, oh, it's for a business, it's not for a particular industry. Like, what was it about like building those sort of things? 'Cause at the time you weren't thinking that it was open source, but like you were probably taking information that you were gathering from all over the place and kind of putting them together, coalescing them into something. Like, when did you realize that like this sort of thing, this open source thing, was actually a thing?
Well, we had Fred Fish, which was a very, very early open source, I don't know, distributions, kind of like a package system where you could get packages on Fred Fish for different computers. So, like if you had an Apple, you could go to Fred Fish and get text games for the Apple. Um, and that was my first exposure to open source, and I thought it was really neat that people could write stuff and other people would use them, because in my prior experience it was just me writing things that I used, but never thought about the idea of me writing things that other people could use, or even publishing them in a way that made them available to others for free. And so I really loved that. My first real open source work wasn't until quite a bit later, though, in the 2000s. Do you remember .NET Nuke?
I do. I very much remember
Yeah,
.NET Nuke.
content management system written on .NET. It was written in Visual Basic, and I was doing VB.NET at the time, and I had a company that wanted a version of .NET Nuke, but they would never accept Visual Basic .NET because it's Visual Basic, and they were snobs.
Hmm.
So I ported .NET Nuke to C Sharp
Yeah.
and open sourced that. Well, it was already open. I just continued to publish,
Sure.
my fork of it in C Sharp, and that was kind of my first exposure to the whole idea of taking something larger and making it available um, to everyone as open source, and it was the kind of the beginning of the floodgates opening.
Sure. That's great. So, I mean, thinking about, at that time, right? Like VB, like C sharp, and now we've gone to the point where there's tens of other languages that I think are, quote unquote mainstream, right? Whether they're for the enterprise or for the I guess the hobbyist developer. And I think, what's interesting about your background is that you've kind of played in those playgrounds with a few of them. Like for instance, like when I think of you, I immediately think of like Go, for instance. Um,
Sure.
yeah. So like what was it about, when you try to learn new things or learn new technologies? Like, what are some of the things that you look for? Are you more of a, I'm just gonna, I've heard of this, I'm gonna play with it, and if I like it, I'll keep going, or do you like to wait for something to kind of get some sort of groundswell before you start to play around with it?
So I definitely like to experiment with things at a kind of a micro level early. If a new programming language comes out, I'll go to the website, I'll look at the code, does it resonate with me? Or does it does it solve problems that I want to solve more efficiently, better, more elegantly? I don't know. Um, and more often than not, I'll spin up a VM and try something in that new programming language or that new tool, whatever it is. It isn't very often that those technologies or languages stick hard, though.
Sure.
The things that have stuck well over the years have been Go and Ruby for me.
Hmm.
I started off with um, Visual Basic, early Visual Basic like VB4,
Yeah.
VB5, um, and moved to Java and then .NET. But it wasn't until Ruby that I started to love the idea of the language itself. Java and .NET or C Sharp specifically, that they were really verbose, whereas Ruby was really elegant and there were magical things happening in the
Sure.
background, and you didn't have to type a lot, and it looked a little bit more like English, and it felt really expressive, and meta programming was amazing. So, Ruby really set the groundwork. But Ruby at the time, I don't know what the performance is like now, but Ruby's performance wasn't amazing, and it
Sure.
wasn't really the multi-threading story wasn't strong there. Concurrency, parallelism, none of that was really great in Ruby. And I was solving a business problem at a credit bureau. I was the CIO of a credit bureau, and our whole credit bureau credit report system was built on Ruby on Rails, which
Oh,
was
okay.
pretty unique at the time. But we had this particular section of our code that was just too slow for our customers. So Go came out. I had played with Go already in 2009. 2010 came around, and I thought, maybe Go is the right answer to solve this particular problem with some concurrency. And we did a trial of that on a few customers, like a little A/B test, and cut our response times down to a third of what they were with the 100% Ruby solution. And that was kind of it for me. I said, Go is a great place to be.
So, when I think of things like Ruby, I think of immediately things like Ruby on Rails, right? Which is kind of like the web implementation of Ruby to an extent, right? Like when
Mhm.
you when so have you always been somebody who prefers to kind of build like backend sort of systems, or did you ever do a foray kind of like in UIs, like, maybe learning, some UI framework or things like that? Or if your interest solely been kind of like, I like the back end stuff because I feel like I have a bit more flexibility to make interesting technology decisions.
So I started doing both front end and back end.
Yeah.
And actually originally there wasn't much of a distinction
Sure.
unless you
Yeah.
did really hardcore client server stuff. When CSS came out, I'm trying to think of the year that would have been, somewhere around 2001 or so, 2002 maybe. CSS was just hitting, and I looked at it and said, "This isn't for me." That's when my front end skills
Sure.
started to diminish, and I focused more on the back end side. And it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago, or maybe a little less than that, that I said, I need to get back up to speed with the front end stuff, and started learning React and JavaScript. I hadn't really done any JavaScript until 2016, maybe.
Okay.
Just didn't like it, didn't want to learn all of that stuff. But I made a point to go back and relearn front end, and I'm glad I did.
I'd
It's still not my
imagine.
favorite place to be.
Yeah, sure. I'd imagine it was pretty jarring for you, right? Like, I think anybody who hasn't been paying attention to like building things for the web, like even if you go like 6 months or a year without paying attention, like it's pretty like jarring, like first
It
seeing it,
really
right?
is.
And like, I'm thinking of like 2016 timeframe. I'm thinking of like, okay, so that's like the height of framework wars, right?
Yep.
Like Angular, React, like all these in
View,
views
so many
there,
of
and
them.
like and you still have like things like jQuery, which are still kind of running like a lot of industry, right? What are some of the things that you noticed? And it doesn't have to specifically tie to like that time, but like there's been inflection points of, like you mentioned, like the .com boom earlier, or you know when we've had kind of this rapid acceleration of like tech in a very particular microcosm. We're kind of seeing it a little bit now with like generational AI. Like, what are some of the things that you remember for some of those times and you're like, okay, well, tech is great, but tech is also like very complicated, super challenging at times. Like, what are some of the things that you think about or have thought about when during those times have come up?
So I learned a particular lesson at that 2016 timeframe where I was definitely thinking poorly of myself. Why can't I
Sure.
get this front end development?
Yeah.
Why can't I do that? And that's when I learned that the Venn diagram that you often see, where you look at other people and it looks like they know everything,
Yeah.
but really a lot of things, and the way your circles intersect with theirs, it just makes them look like they know everything, and you really aren't stupid. You just have more experience in other places, and that
Sure.
was where that really hit home for me when and I have to give a great big shout out, and this is something that's been um, constant throughout my career that I've been trying to pay back. There have been people in my life that have given me their time, their patience, their teaching, their instruction. Whether it was in the early Ruby days for me, Jim Wyrick. I don't know if people out there remember Jim Wyrick. He passed away some time ago, but he was the most generous and kind and giving person with his time. I don't know how many hours he spent tutoring me over email or over the
Yeah.
internet, teaching me how to do Ruby things. And then with the front end, Chris Picardi and um, I'm losing names now because I'm getting old. Sarah worked with us at
Sarah
Microsoft.
Drasner.
Thank you, Sarah
Yeah.
Drasner. Sarah spent hours with me trying to patiently teach me Vue, and she never gave up. And that was a big inflection point for me, having somebody take the time to help me process the data in a way that I could. The tutorials I was finding weren't enough for me, and I couldn't understand the difference between the JavaScript on the server and the JavaScript on the client. I didn't
Yeah.
I didn't realize that there was a difference, and it took Sarah and Chris both, you know, patiently breaking that down to, this is the Node side and this is the JavaScript
Yeah.
side, and they may be communicating while you're building the site, or they may be communicating while you're running the site, but they're different worlds, and you have to use this package manager over here, and you have to bundle this way over here. It was a lot of hand holding and explaining that I wouldn't be able to do any front end development without that time invested. So I always remember those events, those people, and try to emulate that going forward. How can I help the next person? Send the ladder back down so I can teach the next person how to do that thing.
Yeah, I mean, saying the ladder back down, I love that phrase because it just encapsulates, like, I think what we do in tech a lot, in that we're hyper focused on our own careers, hyper focused on what we want to learn. And as we're going through the process of learning, like, we recognize, like, oh, this is painful, this is challenging. And I think there's only a small subset of people that they recognize it and then they try to make that experience less painful for the next set of people that are learning it, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's what's really fascinating to me about tech, is that I think there's no real other industries that I can think of off the top of my head where there's this sharp learning curve that can be flattened by people already in the industry.
Hmm.
Like, I might be missing on, like, somebody in chat scream out like, "Oh, this industry has this issue too." Like, I don't know, maybe banking or something like that, right? But I think of tech, it's like we're so hyper dependent on the work of others, not just of, like, building things, but also learning things. And
Hmm.
I think that that's one of the things that, this generation and future generations, we have a responsibility to tech in general to make it continually less painful. Because I don't, like, you can attest this to more than most, like, it's not getting less complicated to be a technologist, right? Like, you mentioned, like, framework wars. Like, there was a point in time where, yeah, your expectation was you're a full stack developer, you know everything. Like, you need to be able to write CSS as well as write, Node.js servers on the back end, right? Like, you just need to know the entire stack at a very proficient level. And now we're getting hyper specialized because I think the industry is recognizing how challenging that is.
Yeah, I never bought the full stack developer bit because I've done most of the IT jobs, from hardware all the way up to front end. Yeah, and you can't tell me that there's somebody that is hyper proficient at everything from the physical layer all the way up to the
Sure.
presentation layer. They don't exist. You might be full stack web
Yeah.
or full stack backend, but you're definitely not full stack everything. And so I haven't bought that. I never
Yeah.
will.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I think of full stack, I think of like, oh, like I'm building a server side application and I'm building some presentation layer for it, right? But yeah, to your point, like you're very hard pressed to find a lot of people that like know the inner workings of Linux kernels. Like those people are
Hmm.
very limited, right? I guess, and I think what's fascinating about that area is that like all of tech is built on top of some of these primitives, and it seems to me like the farther down the stack you go, the less and less people that are pseudo like subject matter experts or people
Hmm.
that can kind of pass the ladder down. So how do we fix that? Like how do we get more people interested in the underlying primitives of technology when good, bad, or indifferent, like it's not sexy. There's probably not tons of money in it. Like how do we get people excited about those sort of things?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing over the last year or so is I'm working on a desktop Linux distribution called Bluefin.
Mm-hmm.
And George Castro started the whole idea. It's based on Fedora Silverblue, immutable Linux. You know, you get the idea of this stable Linux desktop that doesn't break from underneath you. George took that to a new level by adding containerized deployment. So your Linux operating system deploys from an OCI image, and that's really cool because you can build your own Linux on in a GitHub action and update yourself so you're not dependent on, Ubuntu or Red Hat or somebody else. You use that as a starting point and completely customize anything and everything you want to. That's the reason why Bluefin is cool, but the reason why Bluefin is awesome is because as a project, its philosophy is um, building a great desktop Linux, but growing the next generation of open source contributors while we do it. So, we do lots of great things, and Bluefin's a great operating system to use for desktop Linux. But the more important thing that's happening is we're taking all of these young kids or, even older career changing adults and teaching them how to do cloud native development, teaching them containerization, teaching them the core fundamentals of how to build a Linux operating system. And we're doing it in a way that's fun. And that's been a great time for me.
Yeah, so things like Bluefin are really fascinating to me because like I think that there's a little bit of I think the best way to say it is for people that aren't Linux experts or don't know a lot about Linux, maybe they have played around with Ubuntu, which is, we talked about this a bit earlier. It's kind of about as consumer like Windowsy, Microsoft Windowsy version of Linux as you can get. And then but
Hmm.
other versions have I guess less happy paths for people that don't know like how to hop into a terminal or hop into bash and write things, right? um, so maybe talk a little bit about, is this trying to replace like a lot of the presentation layers that exist between all the different Linux distributions? Is this about building apps? Is it trying
No,
to, yeah.
yeah, we're not trying to take over presentation, and we're not building a new UI. It uses GNOME as
Mhm.
at least Bluefin does uses GNOME as the windowing environment. This is more about um, creating the Chrome OS of Linux,
Yep.
something that
Hmm.
is just rock solid, always works. You can turn on your computer, use it for what you need, turn it off, not think about whether it's going to update because all the updates happen when you reboot.
Yep.
It just happens. You don't have to customize it, and we're not building it for the people who are customizing. We're building it
Sure.
for the people who don't want to, and that's kind of the goalpost for Bluefin is a good Chrome OS like Linux. You
Yeah.
don't have to worry about any of it.
I mean that's fascinating because when I think of Chrome OS, I think of, there's tons of great things about Chrome OS, but me as somebody who likes a little bit of flexibility with things, I see Chrome OS and I'm just like, oh, I can't do really anything on this
Yeah,
thing. Like it needs
can't
connection to
can't
the
open
internet.
files locally. I
Yeah,
can't.
yeah. So
I
like,
don't want to use a web browser to edit things.
sure. So as you're going through, like obviously there's all sorts of complexities here with something, and we don't need to drain the ocean on Bluefin, but like, what are some of the things that you've learned as you've kind of worked through this exercise of like, oh, I didn't even think about that. Like, oh, that's not something that I would ever imagine somebody caring about, but people very much do care about it.
Well, nerds like to bike shed. That's
Yeah,
definitely a thing.
this is
And
true. This is true.
the group of people that has come together to help build Bluefin has been pretty unique because we we as a group tend to focus on um, solving problems without bike shedding where possible, and uh, the culture in the project is such that we openly recognize when there's a good solution. We openly recognize solutions that aren't good, and we collectively choose the better solutions over the worst solutions, and continually try to uh, re-implement things to make them better where we can. And that's been a unique project environment for me, not one that I'm used to. Usually it's driven by the egomaniacal, benevolent leader for life kind of person that
Sure.
says, no, this is going in and nothing else is. We're removing this feature because I don't like it. We're not going to use this because I don't like it. And this is more of a, I don't know, a kind of a cooperative
Sure.
co-op kind of thing. It's been interesting.
Yeah, I prefer the term like the manifesto approach, where it's like, this is my idea. This idea is now documented. It will never change. If you do not agree with this document, do something else. Like, you run into people like that all the time, even in open source, right? Where, like, oh, like you look at somebody's contribute, like, oh, this is a cool project, I want to contribute to it. You look at the contribution guidelines, and you're like, nah, I'm good.
Nope,
I'm
not
I'm
today.
I'm really good. Like, you're gonna make me jump through so many hoops, which you're well within your right, because it is something that you have to maintain going forward or whatever. But I think that there's something to say where it's like, I think that there are some people that want contribution, and there's some people that want control. And I think that you can
Mhm.
have like a Venn diagram of those two things, but you can't have all of both at the same time.
Yeah, see, I like to have two pools of open source. I like to have the projects that I'm doing right now, my pet projects, whatever they
Mm-hmm.
happen to be, and then I like to do a lot of bungee jumping into open source. I'm playing with that new language, playing with that new framework, whatever it is, and I see a problem. I'll bungee jump in, submit a PR to fix the documentation, fix a bug, fix a tiny thing. Just that itty
Yep.
bitty contribution. But I do a lot of those, and I like to be able to do that. And you're absolutely right. If the barrier to contribute is too high, I'm going to walk away from the whole thing because it's not going to be a project that will last long. It won't live long with a high barrier for contributing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree to an extent, but I see, like, I think as your project grows and grows and grows to the point where you have some projects that are so enormous that like it requires teams of people to maintain, right? Whether they're like teams of individuals or teams that are dispersed across many companies, or maybe they're their own company or what have you. The bigger you get, I feel like the larger the barrier to entry is for contribution. Unless it's docs, which I think every technology should have like very low barrier to entry for doc contribution, or unit tests or whatever. But like, for instance, maybe I want to contribute to, I don't know, maybe I want to contribute to Docker, right? Some piece of Docker. You go there, and this isn't a knock on Docker or any big tech company that does this, but it's not advantageous for me as an individual developer to get into that unless I'm going to make it like a something that I'm going to do over and over again. Because
Mhm.
that initial kind of fence that I have to jump over is high in a lot of sense. Like, I was talking the other day about setting up like developer environments, for instance, right? Like, if I can't clone your repo and I can have like a building version of your code in some semblance very quickly, like, I lose a lot of interest. That's just me personally. Other people might like playing around with it and trying to figure out like how underlying things work. Um, are you and the reason why that little rant happened is because I had this question about like being curious about how things work, right? We talked about some technologies earlier where, let's be real, like some of these things, like we aren't supposed to know how they work, right? Like we're just supposed to be like the top layer of abstraction that ends up being used. Have you ever like gone down these rabbit holes of like trying to figure out how things work and you quickly realize like, oh, I didn't really want to do this at all?
Yeah, and as my career has progressed, I've realized that the rabbit holes are infinitely recursive.
Mm-hmm.
You think I'm writing to disk. I'm writing some code that's going to write to disk, and you don't realize that between your code and the compiler and the operating system and the libraries of the operating system and the hardware, there's 30 layers between you and actually getting a bit on a disk.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, well, I typed the save command. Uh,
Yeah.
it should just work.
Sure,
But
sure.
there's so many pieces in between here and there that we tend to live in the abstractions rather than thinking about the depths of them. And I feel most comfortable a layer or two below the normal
Sure.
abstraction. I want to build better patterns to make the higher abstractions.
Yeah.
That's where I have the most fun, I think.
Yeah, I think it also probably plays a little bit to like I think there's a certain type of technologist that wants their customer to be other technologists. So in order to do that, you have to kind of go a level below where most technologists are, right?
Mhm.
Like, to use our framework example, right? Like I want to make sure that every Angular developer is the most productive Angular developer. So I'm going to contribute to the Angular core project, right? Or
Mhm.
whatever, right? Maybe I want to make sure that, this particular distribution of Linux is the best possible iteration of itself. So I'm going to contribute to that distribution. I think those sort of folk, I think you fall into this category, is you have a bit more comfort in the pain than maybe some others do because some of these things aren't as documented as well. There aren't as many guardrails on things because, when you're playing around with some of these lower level technologies, like, let's remember like we're making sand do things that sand should not be doing.
Yeah. And for me, it's been an evolution. I started solving problems for somebody else, and I've evolved into um, helping to make it easier for other people to solve problems for somebody else,
Yeah.
or make it easier for other people to build tools that solve problems for somebody else. I've gone lower
Mhm.
into the abstraction layers as I've gotten more experience and done more things. It's rare to see somebody come straight out of college and start, working at the system D level of Linux.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
just you need to feel that pain using it or doing something without it before it's easy to augment or replace it.
Yeah, which is kind of funny because if you think about, technology 40 years ago, right? Before object oriented programming like took over, you would have people who are building COBOL and Fortran apps, right? And like that's pretty damn close to like as low as you can get to an extent, right?
Mm.
Like, you're still building on top of an operating system and you're not touching bare metal, but like, you're doing all of your work like in a terminal with text and all of that, right? And the reason why I bring this up, I'm fascinated by like the evolution of tech away from that. And you mentioned something that's interesting is like people don't get started like building like at the system D level or at the Linux kernel level, but some do, right? Like I remember when I was fresh out of college, I joined an insurance company, and one of the people that started with me, I was asking them what they worked on, and they're like, "Oh, I'm maintaining COBOL apps. Like that's the job that I got hired to do, like out of college," which I think still to this day happens, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
So let's position a little bit to talk a little bit more about like one of the things that I really appreciate you for as somebody who follows you on the different social media platforms is, like you embrace the community, right? I think that's something that, you know, there's a lot of folks out there that do it, but I don't think a lot of people do it as well as you do. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, you know, what do you think about the community and the technology that you care about? What are some of the things that are challenging? What are some of the things that, kind of bring you hope?
So being community oriented is definitely not something I was born to. It isn't
Sure.
a skill that I had innately. It's something that I am learning as I go.
I see.
I still tend to think individually rather than collectively, and it's always an evolution, a struggle to think and act at a community level rather than at an individual level. So that's something I need to make clear right away. It's, I do lots of community things, but their their effort. It's not a natural thing. There are some people that are just born community leaders, born community people. I am not one of those. I would be happy in my cave with my lights off, writing code all day long, not interacting with anybody. That's my world. I'm fine with that. But I know that we stand on the shoulders of giants. We have to build things together, and things get better with other people's help. That's a learned skill for me.
But Brian, you make it look so easy though. Like, I mean,
No.
no, I'm not sure. I'm not trying to pump your ego, but like, but in all honesty, I think, and I've said this to a lot of folks, is that you might not, even if you don't think you have like the right skills, you have the right temperament. Like, if you have the passion for something, if you really want to move forward things, like you're going to discover things about yourself that typically you probably weren't aware of, right? Like the ability to just be a voice of people. Like, that's something that not a lot of people think they have, but if you care enough about something, you can be a
Yeah.
voice for that. And one of the things, so as a part of like this community work, like, I think that we fall into the same categories. Like, if you do community work, you end to an extent, you end up creating content. And creating content is a very fickle business. I think everybody can admit that. What are some of the things that, when you're building content or you're even consuming content, that you look for that really thinks that leads to really successful results?
So consuming content, I always enjoy seeing clearly written words with examples that are as close to real world as they can be. If I start seeing foo and bar and baz in an example, my mind shuts off. Show me something that's real. How can I use this to solve a real problem? Even if it's not my problem,
Sure.
show me a real problem, a concrete issue. Um, I care less about the quality of a video or the quality of the audio than I do about the message and about the delivery of the message. Um, and I got to be honest, I'm definitely almost 20 years older than you. I don't watch a lot of video. It's just not the format that I enjoy, mostly because it requires too much attention for me.
Sure.
So, I like to glance at a document and go back to work, or look at an
Yeah.
example and apply it. Sitting down and watching a 30-minute um, podcast on YouTube or a tutorial, I need bite-sized 3-minute things or I'm gone.
So
And
what I'm hearing
that's
is
my
that this
attention span.
podcast idea is terrible. I shouldn't be in this podcast game. Is what I'm
Well,
hearing.
no, because the world has already voted that these are great things.
Sure.
I know
Sure.
dozens of people that love and enjoy spending their time, even if it's
Yeah.
just in the background, doing those things. And I had the Go Time podcast. We did 100
Yeah.
plus episodes of the Go Time podcast. I never listened to a podcast in my entire life, but hosted one for a long time. It's just not something that interests me.
No, I've always said that everybody's different in how they want to learn. Like, some people, like, there's a reason why you can still buy books, right? Technology
Hmm.
books. Like, some people like to sit down and read, like, not in front of a computer. They want to sit down and read, which is cool. Some people that want to, like you said, watch people live stream code for 3 or 4 hours and all of that sort of great stuff. Like it just depends on what brings you the most joy, which I think is important. You mentioned something interesting about like documentation and like if you see a real world problem versus a real like I'd love to get your thoughts on something like Hello World, because I think as a technologist, like we've all seen 4,000 implementations of Hello World, but as we all know, like Hello World does not go very far. And I've always seen there's two kinds of like tech content. There's Hello World, and there's the thing that takes like an hour to stand up.
Yeah.
And in the middle, there's nothing. That's, in my opinion, very good. I've been trying to solve this problem, I think, for years, and I haven't figured out what the magic bullet is. I'd love to get your thoughts on like quality of content versus like getting started to like real world example, because I think that's something that's always fascinating to me about content creation, is that like there's nothing like in the middle. Like it's either here's how you stand up Kubernetes cluster with 4,000 Helm charts and all these sort of things, and here's Hello World.
Yeah, and it's such a hard question to answer because I think every domain has a different answer.
Yeah.
When you're talking about Kubernetes, understanding pods and deployments and those sorts of things are critical, and deploying a Hello World container that runs, an Nginx static web server, that's actually a big step for somebody who hasn't done Kubernetes before.
Sure.
But then building a controller that spawns database instances for you automatically to scale your database on your Kubernetes cluster, that's a level 5 layers below where you're deploying Nginx, and you need both of those things. Mm-hmm. But you also have to have a journey. You have to have the start and the middle and the end. And I think that's where a lot of companies fail in their content delivery is not having that clear path of, you're just getting started with this technology. Here's what you're going to use it and how you're going to use it. And here's how to get started versus, I'm an expert and I'm deploying this thing and I need to, make a big change to the underlying plumbing. Here's how you do that. And that journey isn't really clear in most systems. I think Microsoft documentation, that was a thing that I really enjoyed about doing developer relations at Microsoft. That was a tenet of the Microsoft documentation philosophy, which is, give them the beginner content, give them the intermediate content, give them the advanced content, but we're not going to ship anything unless it's all there.
There's like, so how I like to phrase this is no ladder, right? Like, here's your first introductory to this content, and here's where you probably want to be eventually. And here are all the steps you need to take that process. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned like, there's some companies that do it very well, but some companies that, don't do it very well at all. The expectation is you're going to learn it yourself by reading just like I'm just going to say it, very rough to read documentation, or you're going to...
Or the source code.
Or the source code, yeah. So, that's kind of like my gripe with like learning content these days, is that if the expectation is that you are some form of informed in a particular topic area, like I've done this joke a few times. I can't really do it anymore because I kind of learned it. Like I tried like multiple times to learn Go, like, going through like the getting started experience in Go, and it just never stuck with me because I don't think I was ever doing something practical. Mm-hmm. And then I decided like, I'm actually going to do it. Like over this holiday break, I'm just going to do it. So like I found what are some like actual accessible projects that I can build, that I can contribute to that are written in Go. I looked at the Azure Developer CLI. Oh, well, that's like, it's not super complex. There's some stuff in there. Like, so I contributed to it. So like now I know Go, which is great. But I think one of the things that I struggled with learning Go initially was I couldn't like, why would I ever use this for a particular task when I know other languages so much better?
Yeah, very much. It's interesting that you mentioned that because I found that I want to buy books on how to do a thing, like how
Mm,
to program in Rust, or how to use Spring in Java, or whatever it is. But I can never finish the books. I barely even
yeah.
start the books because they never solve a problem that I want to solve.
Yeah.
So the only time I buy tech books is when my friends write them. And I have a big stack of tech books because I have a lot of friends, but I haven't
Sure.
read any of them. Instead, I go to the documentation for the project and try to figure out how to solve a problem that I have, or maybe resolve a problem that I've solved in other languages before. That's a really common learning tool for me.
Yeah.
Let's write this one tool. Now we'll do it in Rust. Now
Yeah.
we'll do it in Go. Now we'll do it in Python. And that helps me with a domain I'm familiar with, but a new method that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful hint is like, oh, I've already built something like in Python or whatever. Like I'm just going to try to rewrite this thing in some other language. Not because I think that like this language is better for this particular test. Maybe it is, but just because I already know the end result, so I can work towards that end result a bit better. I
Hmm.
think, one of the things that I really appreciate about a lot of getting started documentation is that it does dive into the weeds pretty quickly because I think we at times do need to know some of like the principles of things.
Hmm.
But
The why.
yeah, but in the same thing, like if I'm, maybe I'm okay, I joined a company like, oh, now you're a Go developer. Not to keep on banging on Go, but I'm just gonna use Go as an example. Like, oh, you're gonna be a Go developer. Like, here's this project in Go. Like, here's some issues assigned to you. Like, do it, right? Like I can look at source code. Like Go is great because the source code is fairly readable, right?
Fairly, yeah.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, like I don't know how modules work. Like I don't know how all these sort of components or constructs of the language work. I don't know how error handling works. I need to go figure out how to do those things. So it's interesting to me, like the approach that some technologies do. It's like we're gonna put everything into your face before you even do Hello World. And then some other technologies like run this script, and now you have Hello World, right?
Look, you've got Hello World. You don't know why you have it, but you have it.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is fascinating. Like that approach is, depending on. I think what it's probably the like some technologies are more accustomed to. Like I think of Docker when I think of like Hello World. Like I know that like you're not writing code typically for Docker. Like Docker's just a platform basically.
Hmm.
But it's like download Docker desktop, open up a command line, put in this command to run the hello world container, right? It's like, what's going on here? I have no idea, but you have a container now.
Yeah. And the layers of plumbing
Yeah.
underneath that container can be ridiculous if you're on a Windows or Mac. You know,
Yeah.
there's a virtual machine under there doing that. A lot of people still don't understand that. I was talking to somebody in Discord the other day, and they didn't realize that the Linux Docker containers that they were running on their Windows desktop were actually running in a virtual machine,
Yeah.
also on their Windows desktop.
Yeah. And I think this is a great place to finish up on is like, how much do we need to know in technology, right? Like, I think, depending on your level of interest, you can learn the different levels, right? We've talked about that. But like, if I'm a technologist and I want to solve problems, like maybe I'm an Angular developer, or maybe I'm building something in Rust, which I think does require like a fair amount of knowledge about primitives of technology. But like, let's say I'm trying to like, how much do I really care about how these things are done? Like you're talking about the hyper virtualization of things on Windows to be able to spin up a very very small version of Linux on a machine. Like these sort of things are like thousands of people have built technology over the years to get to the point where we are, right?
Yeah.
The question becomes like, do we need to care?
So I'll skirt around answering that question
That's fair.
by
That's fair.
telling you something I did early in my career, a decision I made early in my career, which was not to specialize in one thing. I
Sure.
started off as basically a database developer, I
Yep.
guess, writing applications that talk to databases. And I made the choice when it was time to change my job to do something new and challenging. And I've done that multiple times so that I've had a very broad experience across the technologies, at front end and back end, server hardware level IT administration. And that that has taken me to where I am now, where now I understand a lot more of both the high level and the lower level stuff because of those years of dabbling in all of the different things. And for me personally, not becoming an expert in one area has been a great boon because it has allowed me to see the broader picture and see which pieces can be brought together to solve problems as opposed to only having one hammer and looking at everything like a nail.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to think about it too, because I think we're, like I mentioned this a bit earlier, we're not in a short of problems that need to be solved. Like, we're always going to be at a point where we need to solve a problem. And, even we talk about things like generational AI and like how it's going to replace technologists and all these sort of things. It's like, is it really, or are you always going
No.
to need to be there to solve the problem? You just have new tools, right?
Yeah, I don't. There may be some really menial jobs that will be automated by generational AI of some sort, but most of the technology jobs that I can think of won't be. They'll be augmented. They'll be enhanced. You'll be more productive, faster, hopefully. But somebody still has to be smart enough to make sure that the thing the computer is generating is not crap. It's not
Yeah.
garbage, and it will get better over time. But still, if you don't know the underlying technology that's being spit out by this AI, you may put garbage into production, security holes, big bugs. Who knows? Somebody
Yeah,
has to know those things.
this is true. And I think it's a great place to end on because I think it talks about, some people just want to do the job and make money, which is cool. And other people, I think, like yourself, you want to make the industry better. You want to, like you said, send the ladder down, and but you want to always kind of have that growth mindset of learning, right? Which I think those two things go hand in hand, which I think is great. So, as we wrap up, I love to ask my guests like one final kind of anecdotal sort of looking back question. And, we've been talking for about an hour about, your career in tech, some different tech topics, open source. When you think about those things in your career through technology, like what are some of the things you think about? Like using one or two words.
One or two words.
Yeah. Yeah. No free lunch, man.
Um, I'd have to say exponential would be one of the words that I'd choose. Uh, the way things build upon themselves and grow so fast in technology. That's definitely a word I would choose to describe, the last 30 years of my career. Uh, and it's only through hindsight that you can go back and see, this starting point blossomed, ballooned into this larger thing where now I'm able to do all of this other stuff. And
Yeah.
that's a word I'd pick. It's a
That's
tough
great.
question though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also talks to like the growing rate of technology, right? Like, even though we have caps to how fast technology can grow by science, like that's not stopping innovation at all, which I think is great.
No.
And what also has been great is in this conversation, Brian, I really appreciate taking the time to chat with me. For folks that aren't following Brian on different social medias, like I highly recommend you doing so. You can find him on Twitter or X at B Ketelson. That's Bketelsen. There'll also be some links to some other places that you can find Brian in the show notes. As we part, my friend, is there anything that you'd like to say?
Well, so for the beginners out there, don't be afraid to be curious, and there are no bad questions. Go ask the questions and find the people who are willing to answer them. If the people you ask the questions to aren't willing to answer them, move on and find the others who will. There's lots of people who are eager and excited to help you grow. So don't be afraid to go out and try new things and explore and learn because that's the day you stop exploring and learning is the day you stagnate, and I don't ever want to stagnate.
No, I cannot agree more. Like, I think the idea of doing the same thing over and over again, like, what is it? What did I say? Repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting
Yeah,
different results is the
expecting a different outcome.
yeah, exactly right. It's a bit of insanity. But I mean, I appreciate people that are always curious. That's the reason why I have this show. And I'm glad to have learned a bit more about you and see also that you're curious about things. And thank you everybody for tuning in live as well as listening to this in the future. My name is Isaac Levin from my friend Brian Ketelson. This has been Coffee and Open Source. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Isaac.